When I was a young player in my early teenage years, I think I was fearless. I would go on stage and I was excited, not frightened. I didn't want to hide. I was happy to be there. And I think when I grew up, the thing that made me more and more afraid had nothing to do with my playing. It had all to do with the way I would be perceived by people. And I think it's where fear and anxiety resides. If you want to come on stage to please people, then you're going to be afraid. If you come on stage with some kind of satisfaction of the work you have accomplished and being proud of your work, the feeling of anxiety is going to be really reduced.
All right, it is true. I wrangled yet another one of my LA Phil colleagues to be a guest on my podcast to find out, do people choose their instruments or is it actually the other way around? And the biggest question I want to get answered today is, what is the best color for a professional harp? We've got the principal harp of the Los Angeles Philharmonic to guide us through all these questions. Stay tuned to find out. Coming right up on the Honesty Pill podcast. All right, everybody, welcome to episode 40 of the Honesty Pill podcast. We are here to help you with all things music and productivity, whether it's getting better at your practice, performance, or auditions, or just dealing with productivity and how to function like a normal, happy human being, which I know is really hard to do these days. So our guest today is the man behind the bright red harp at the Los Angeles Philharmonic, Emmanuel Ceysson. But first, a quick shout out to the sponsor of the Honesty Pill podcast, the Yamaha Corporation of America. Stay tuned. You're going to hear more about them later. Yamaha helps me bring this podcast to you 100% totally free. Okay, I lied. It's 99.9% totally free. What I ask of you is that you click like on this video right now and, of course, subscribe to the YouTube channel if you haven't done so already. Both of those things really do help us out over here at Honesty Pill Mission Control. And thanks so much for all of your support, everyone. I really do appreciate it. And we are, as always, live streaming this episode, so go ahead and drop your questions in the chat on Facebook or YouTube. All right, let's get into this conversation with my rock star colleague. Welcome to the show, Emmanuel Ceysson.
Hey, Chris, thank you for having me.
That's a super pleasure. I bet my colleagues at the Philharmonic are always wondering, oh God, here he comes. He's going to ask me to be on his podcast. So thank you for saying yes.
Actually, I'm really glad I can, I really love this kind of because I have, of course, looked a little bit at what you are doing. And I think it's really great that you get to give access to all of these different, opinion people to young musicians.
Well, I appreciate that. And I think that a big part of this whole process of mastery or getting a job as an orchestral musician or pretty much anything is shrouded in misinformation, limiting assumptions, and just straight up myths. And I think it's important to connect with people who've figured out what it is that other people are trying to do and just break that down. So I hope we can do that today. I like to kick things off with a little detective work on my guest's website. And yours caught my eye with the words "l'enfant terrible." I hope my French was okay there, in bold letters. So talk to me about that nickname. What's the story behind that title? How did you end up with that?
Well, long story short, being a male harpist can be a challenge. Let me elaborate a little bit. When I picked the harp when I was 7 years old, I had absolutely no clue that it was an instrument that was more kind of attached to the feminine image. Like it had some kind of, like when you see a lot of harpists, I think I can go as far as saying that 90% of the harpist population on the planet is female, and it's great. It's amazing that there is such a strong impression on the instrument. But at the same time, when you're a boy and you pick the harp at 7 and you have absolutely nothing related to gender, you don't think about it. You just love the instrument for what it is. And so for me, I think I build a lot of my process with the harp in fighting against the image it has, this kind of angelic, pure, in a way very feminine in all of the stereotypes we attach to that, obviously, and it's of course very reductive. So I think most of my time with the harp, at least when I started to go into the teenage period, it was a lot of trying to find my identity, to differentiate myself from this cliche of the feminine harp in a way. And so it got me to kind of try to redefine my connection with the instrument in a more um, in a more physical way, in the sense of strength, and find like a bigger sound, for example, find more definition in the articulation, things that was not attached to this ethereal, angelic thing that people think when it's the first thing they have in their mind when they think about the harp, basically.
It's amazing. And I think it's the same thing happens in sports too. There are certain
Oh yeah.
sports that are just traditionally male or female. And why? Like, where did this come from? It reminds me of a great commercial from Nike that said they had this interviewer who walked up to people in random public parks and handed them a tennis ball and said, throw like a girl. Show us how you throw like a girl. And all these clueless men would just be like, throwing very weakly or whatever their warped impressions of what a female would throw like. And then the video would cut to like these incredibly gifted professional athletes who are female who just like smoked the ball
Yes,
over the
bigger
plate.
harp, and yeah, like almost.
And I think the same thing is true with many brass instruments. I can think of like 3 female tuba players who are all amazing, by the way, and trumpet players, same thing. I mean, it's finally, I think, becoming less of a weird identity to just play whatever instrument you
And
want.
I'm glad it is. I'm glad it is. Like if you
Totally.
look at for example, if you look at the most cliched institution in terms of like sexism, the Vienna Phil, uh, the first female member was a harpist, and it was not 100 years ago.
Right. Wasn't it in like when was it? Like 80s or something?
Yeah,
Or was
no,
it
a little bit
Berlin?
before that. No, no, I think that I would say in the 60s, something like this. But still, like the fact that
That's absolutely insane. So this is actually a good segue into I like to talk about what people do when they're not in the practice room or on the stage. You also are quite the baker, from what I understand, and we need to hear the story behind the lemon frosted vanilla pound cake.
oh my gosh. Um, the thing is, like I grew up in France. I grew up in a family that was um, non-musical. My mother and my father were both professor in high school, so they were educated like on the intellectual side of profession of the professional life, I would say. But they were not really professional musicians at all. So, but they still found important to bring my sister and I to concerts, theater plays, things like this when we grew up. So that's kind of how I went to music, is by going to shows and realizing that I had something particular, a particular connection with it. And so on top of that, there was the cooking. And we cook a lot in France. It's really like, it's funny. My first visit in the United States, it was for a competition in 2004. And I was staying with a host family, and they offered me brownies for dessert. And I was like, they kind of tasted strange. And then I understood that they were coming out of a box, basically. It was a box with everything. You just add eggs and then you put them in the oven and it makes brownies. And I'm like, and that was the first image I got of America. It's like this whole, and people don't they don't it's not done so that people don't cook. It's just because you think that you don't have the time to cook, or you don't have the time to do anything. So cooking should be like the last of your concerns. So you just throw everything in a bowl and then you put it in the oven and it works like this. And for me, baking was actually also an approach of life, I would say it, like, because if you want to bake anything from scratch, you have to follow precise instructions, you have to follow different weights, you have to bring ingredients in a certain like time frame, like let it rest, etc. It's like both a chemical process and and so for me, I think cooking and learning how to cook was an important part also of disciplining myself behind the harp in a way. Because when you follow recipe, it's like you follow when you learn new music. You are kind of like new music in front of you as your recipe, and then you need to find your way to um, bake it.
So I never was drawn to baking, but I was drawn to making beer. And
Yeah,
it's a similar thing where you can go down to the gas station and buy a 6-pack of Budweiser, or you
yeah,
can make a Czech lager in your own garage. And the great thing about what you just said about the recipes and the discipline is there's only really 4 ingredients in beer. And
Yeah.
the thing that people have done with those four ingredients that is so varied is similar to Mozart or Strauss or whoever. They really only
Yeah.
have so many ingredients to work with and how they can change it and morph it. So that's a really interesting parallel.
Yeah, I think so. And also it goes with the fact that you say that, but at the same time, you have to also be educated about how to taste it properly. Because if you ask the middleman to just, drink a Bud Light and something like that has been refined and made in state of the art, he's going to taste there is a difference, obviously. But
Indeed.
has to explain it and say that why this is so much more amazing or the complexity, you need to be educated to perceive it. And I think we also need that in classical music in a way. It's like I think it's important that the audience that come to us are educated in a way. Like I don't mean they need to go to school before to come, but we need to bring them something to understand that they are listening to something exceptional and just not like a bunch of people playing together.
Let me ask you this, because this is something I've been thinking about a lot this week at the LA Phil. And this sounds like a very esoteric question, but it is on my mind this week is what is the purpose of art? What is the purpose of the music we play? We do a lot of new music at the LA Phil, and some of it is definitely challenging for the listener, and it'll evoke different. You listen to John Williams' Olympic Fanfare, you get a very specific emotional reaction to that. You listen to the Barber Adagio or the scherzo, not the Adagio from Mahler's Fifth Symphony, and it connects. So sometimes music doesn't make you feel that way. Sometimes it makes you feel incredibly uncomfortable and makes you feel like you don't understand what it is. And I think that's okay sometimes, is to evoke a negative reaction. What do you think about that in terms of the new music that we produce?
Well, I am coming from France, where Pierre Boulez invented the IRCAM, which is like an institute for like new music. And so we have the tendency in France to take new music very seriously, but also it has to follow a certain set of rules or concepts that Pierre Boulez established in a way. And I think I was very reluctant when I grew up towards contemporary music, towards new music. And actually, it was not before I went to the United States that I started to understand that the stage was much broader than what I thought, and that whatever rules had been established for serious contemporary music did not have to apply to new music. And so, new music um, can be challenging to listen to, but also can be really pleasant. And I think it's important that we give it the space that it deserves. Also, we need to know, because sometimes for us, I'm going to speak for myself, as a musician in an orchestra like the LFL, which plays so much new music, almost a new piece every week, basically. We have to remember that, in any time in history, you had new music coming, and maybe 1% of it made it to posterity. And we need to accept this kind of this process. We need to accept that maybe out of 100 pieces we play, there is only going to be one that is going to be great to enough people that is going to stay longer. But at the same time, we need to do this work of exploring new things, even though sometimes we really get the feeling that what we are doing is not great.
You also mentioned education. And I've thought about this before, that it's sort of like wine, and we can probably talk about wine for an hour, being from France. You don't need to know anything about wine to enjoy it. You can say, I like it, I don't like it. However, if you start to educate yourself and understand the different regions and the different nuances of the grapes and how the earth and the sun work together, you will have more of an appreciation for what it is that you liked or didn't like. And it will help guide you to maybe wine that you might prefer in the future, and just connecting it more to the community and the earth and the people that did it. I feel like the same thing is true with music. You do not need a musicology degree to listen to a Mozart symphony. You can just let it wash over you. Or, a brand new piece by John Adams. You can just listen to it. But I do agree that a little bit of information can help expand the experience. How do we bring that to people in a way that is efficient, economical, impactful? Like I would love if the LA Phil actually had a podcast
I
that
was going to say a podcast like yours is in a way a good way to approach it. I'm going to refer to a personal example. My sister-in-law, who is not a musician at all, she's actually a landscape architect. She lives in San Francisco, And until recently, she had absolutely no interest in classical music. And then after a few years, because she met a friend that brought her to the San Francisco Symphony, she took a subscription. And suddenly, like, it took time, but it grew on her. And now I think she could tell you more about Mahler symphonies, about their history, about the life of Gustav Mahler than I would, for example. Because for me, the process of music making, playing, for example, a Mahler symphony, does not necessarily include to have an extensive knowledge about the history of the composer. Sometimes it can help, but it's not necessarily essential for me uh, uh, to play the part, to have all of this knowledge. And so what I mean by this, using this example, is like, um, if if you need to get hooked first, and then you will, like wine, you will get more educated if you feel the need to. And some people is going to be Mahler symphonies, some other is going to be Brahms symphonies, some other is going to be, I mean, Debussy, just not to be biased here. But yeah, that's the idea. Is like you need to be hooked first, I think, to have an experience that is like, dragging you into it, of people, a group of friends, things like this, and then you can dig a little bit deeper if you want to. And usually it happens.
That's brilliant. We're going to circle back to WC in a minute. You mentioned you come from a non-musical family, but our cultural influence, food, museums, what have you, was important. You grew up in Lyon, is that correct?
Yeah, yeah.
So how did harp come in intersecting into your life in terms of all the instruments you saw? What drew you to the harp, and how did you pick it?
So I fell in love with the harp when I was 6 years old. What happened is, like, in France, because I told you, so my parents wanted me to touch a little bit of everything. So I would go to shows, but I would also, like, go. I was part of a swimming team. I learned to swim pretty early. So I was doing sports. I was doing some theater. I was doing some, like, pottery. So, all of these extracurricular activities. And we have this option in France. It's like, it's a great system. It's like, in any mid-sized city to big city, you have what is called a conservatory, which is a place where it's a school of music, when you can actually learn for almost nothing. It's like, you don't need to pay for a tuition, and you get, like, accessible free music education. Um, the great thing about it is, like, it's not only an instrument. It starts with a lot of theory and music listening and things like this. So for some people it's very discouraging, but for me it was perfect, because I am a pretty nerdy person. I have brains that are a little, sometimes, thinking too much. But for me, so learning, like, the music through listening of pieces, like, so I remember my first year of music initiation was like Firebird. There was obviously some Mozart, so the Little Night Music, the Toy Symphony, this kind of easy approachable music. And there was the Flute and Harp Concerto by Mozart. And the second movement, the Adagio in F major, starts. And of course, all of this comes with a beautiful melody played by the flute on top of it. But for me, that was this precise moment, this harmonic progression. That got to my ear, and especially the way it was presented, with the sound, the depth of the sound of the harp, that got me immediately hooked. And I was like, what is this instrument that I'm hearing? I didn't even know what it looked like. It was just by hearing it. And then, so it was at 6 years old, and at 7, I was given the opportunity to choose to pick an instrument. And obviously, piano and flute and violin get the first success. So usually you don't have this many spots. But anyway, for me it was the harp, and there were open spots for harp. So that's how I started.
It's amazing that you heard that sound and were drawn to it without seeing it. I would have thought you would have thought it was a classical guitar or something.
Yeah, but I was lucky enough to listen to a recording that is really special. There was this French harpist. She was actually born in Russia, Jewish, who fled Russia because there were persecutions, and grew up in France and learned the harp. She was this very tiny woman. She her name was Lily Laskin. She looked like, I say tiny because she was literally like really really tiny, and she didn't look great. Like she was typically not the typical harpist you would imagine, tall with blonde long hair. She was the opposite of that. Even though through her deformity, in a way, physical deformity, she was able to produce a very special sound. Like it was so deep, and it was not sounding like a guitar at all. Like it was, so it was really, some people when they come to a harp recital, they come out and they tell you, "Oh my gosh, it sounded so much sometimes like a piano, but also sometimes like a guitar and things like this." And the interest of the harp is this versatility in what range of colors you can produce with the instrument. And I think this is really mainly due to the fact that we use the skin to play, like the bare skin. And so depending of what part of the finger you use, and of course you have calluses after a while, but like the way you use the part is really going to influence the kind of the nature of the sound that come out. And that's really important in a way to be able to also develop this kind of range of colors. And so this harpist Lily Laskin, when I listened to her playing Mozart at 6 years old, the depth and the quality of the tone was so amazing that I didn't really confuse it for a guitar. It was just, what is this?
You mentioned Lily Laskin and also Isabel Moretti in some of your interviews
Yeah.
as influences on you early on. Clearly, you mentioned. So, what was it about Lily Laskin that gave her that ability to create all that color? And the reason I'm asking is, especially in the brass world, people are always concerned about the orientation of their teeth or the thickness of their lip or whatever. And the reality is, none of that stuff actually matters really in terms of production. It impacts your approach and maybe some of the nuances of the equipment, but everyone is capable of producing all the different types of articulation and sound. How does that translate to harp?
Well, it's actually the same. The problem is like anybody can play the harp with a very beautiful sound unless they have bones instead of skin their fingers. But what I mean is like the principle of a beautiful sound on the harp is just like to pull the string in the right direction. So it's going to be either towards you or towards the audience this way. But this is the way to get a good sound of the harp. The problem is like most of the people, when they are taught, they follow this kind of set of rules. And they are taught to put their thumb very high and the rest of the fingers very low. And then it doesn't allow them to actually articulate in the right direction. They end up articulating laterally, which sounds like a guitar. and so because of this like very basic early mistake, you end up with a lot of harpists that have no idea of how to produce a nice sound. And so Lily Laskin, Isabel Moretti, all those are the people that really, I think, had a concept of sound production through the technique that was different. And I tried as soon as I could. I wanted to learn from them. So Lily Laskin was dead when I was a few years old. But Isabel was one of her, in a way, heiress, you can say that, and so I took so much from her and from her professor, Isabel's professor Germaine Lorenzini, who was principal of the Lyon Symphony Orchestra when I grew up. So she was actually geographically in the same zone when I grew up, and I picked so much from both of them.
So I want to talk about your style in a second, but this brings up a topic of education and the model, at least in the U.S., of how we teach beginners. Generally speaking, typically, unless you're very lucky, you are learning your basics from someone who probably does not play your instrument. And also, high praise to all the band directors out there who've learned how to play a little bit of everything. God bless you for your service. I love what you're doing. But I wonder if, and I have this conversation with my colleagues all the time, if a player like you or someone who's achieved this level would be able to communicate what they're doing to a beginner, like you mentioned with the hands. Certainly there's plenty of stuff that we do. What an impact as far as inspiration and longevity, as far as not having to unlearn all those bad habits later. But it's just not the model, is it?
Yes, it's well, you're right, it's not the moral, but also first of all, I try to do it as much as I can. Like when I was at the Paris Opera for 10 years, I had a program in Colombia. Don't ask me why, but there was a foundation there that was dealing with harps. And so I started a program there, and I would go there twice a year to give like free education for a week. And there would be a lot of very beginners. So we would like go to the real basic of how to pull a string and how to let the sound come out of them. um, and then, for example, now that I'm in Los Angeles, there is this YOLA program, like Young Orchestra of Los Angeles. And so Gustavo really pushed me when I joined, so that we should try to get harpists. And we actually recruited a couple of them. And we have been doing, me and with another tutor, Christina Montes, an amazing work with them to actually. And it's true that when they are learning from someone who has a higher status in a way, like a principal of the field, they come to you with like little stars in their eyes, and they are so much willing to actually get more in the process. But it's a very big problem. If you ask me, the education process for classical music in America, there is a big problem there. If I could elaborate a little bit, is like everything is really private here. You don't really have you have of course pre-colleges in some main ports, main cities, and things like this, where you can send your kids. But for us, as I explained in France, is we learn first the basics, and not even on an instrument. Like we learn the basics of solfège, and it's basically like learning your ABC, but for music. And then when we have a little bit of background, not too much, like I think it's a year or a year and a half, and then we get to an instrument. But then we don't let go of theory. Theory goes with the instrument training. The problem in the US is like you usually sometimes start, especially the harp, with a private instructor, and this private instructor is costly, and you see them 1 hour a week, and there is so much they can do in 1 hour. It limits the amount of information you can get. And I think, especially for a polyphonic instrument like the harp, you already have so many things to figure out just with your fingers. And so you have a lot of Suzuki teachers, like the Suzuki method, which is great for imitating and things like this. But in my opinion, it doesn't give you enough idea of what polyphony means, what harmony means, what a chord is, how is it built, etc., etc. And this background, if you miss it when you are young, you can get to it later in your life. It's fine, but it's going to be a tougher process than doing it in the very beginning, in my opinion.
I agree with you about Suzuki. Luckily, we found a Suzuki teacher for our daughter who plays violin, who combines the good qualities of Suzuki with also the musical inspiration and some history and some theory. But I do hear what you're saying. And for brass, it almost doesn't exist. There's so many different approaches, and our instrument education is so much.
At the same time with the brass, what I love, I played some trombone. Actually, my second instrument was trombone. I started with the trombone when I was like 12. And what I loved about it is that you had this, immediately from my first lesson of trombone, there was this group thing. So we would warm up together, we would play things together, we would play in a group. There is this sense of belonging to a group that comes with brass learning, and that is really important in also developing your ear in a way, because depending of the what voice you're playing and things like this, and you listen differently to music. So every instrument and the way you learn them has their strength and their pros and their cons. But I really love that about the brass, is like, because when you learn an instrument like the piano or the harp, which are polyphonic by themselves, you also end up spending a lot of time alone.
Yeah, you're making my job so easy. That's a great segue into your particular style, because you do have a way, and I hope this comes across as a compliment. You have a way of playing the harp that is reminiscent of a brass instrument, which is not surprising to hear that you started out on a brass instrument.
Yeah.
You talked about stereotypes earlier in terms of the angelic quality of a harp. You play with such power and grounding that I'll say with 100% confidence that you are able to lead the orchestra from the back of the orchestra with an instrument that is not generally. What's that?
I will leave that with you. Like, I don't know if I'm leading the orchestra. It's your opinion.
Well, no, I mean, because there are many times your instrument, you mentioned, is very flexible. There are times when your instrument is adding flourishes and icing on the cake. But there are other times when you are the motor, you are the rhythmic driver of what maybe the flute player is doing, or pizzicato, or whatever's going on around it. And I haven't heard anyone play with so much command as you do. And I think that's probably where your l'enfant terrible nickname has come to. That you're very much a soloist who works as an ensemble musician within the orchestra. And I think that is rare and kind of unique with your instrument.
Well, thank you for the compliment to begin with. But then there is no short answer to that, but I will have to try to be as concise as I can. Is the thing is the harp is really particular in an orchestra. If you look at it, it's really its own thing. The woodwinds, they're a group of people, and they play chords together, and they are each of them has one voice, and they complete and they make an ensemble. Same goes for the brass. Same goes for the strings. Like you group people and you make them play as an ensemble. And then you have percussions are a bit similar to the harp, I would say, or orchestral piano or celeste, things like this. Those are solo instruments that play with a color that cannot be found in any other place in the orchestra. It is just like their own thing. And so, if you, according to this, you need to have a soloist approach in your orchestral playing. It's my opinion, because you are the only one doing what you do. You are the only one producing this particular color that is needed in this particular moment. And so, the only way to approach that is to, as a soloist, of course, you are not gonna, it's like playing Nutcracker Cadenza or a solo concerto in front of the orchestra. It's not what I mean by being a soloist. What I mean is like knowing that your singularity is very important and needs to be integrated in a bigger picture. So here you need to adapt your playing to something, to a context existing at a given moment, but it still has to be a solo approach. You need to approach it as a soloist.
Let's give some context, actually, because I want to shift gears to just a lot of people who listen and watch this podcast are not harpists or sometimes even musicians. And I know that your instrument is confusing to many people. There are pedals. Yeah. Can you just give us a brief, quick rundown? How do you even know what strings you're playing? How is it like the piano? How is it different? What are the pedals for? All that stuff.
Yeah, so I'm gonna oversimplify a little bit, but it's for the purpose of the general audiences, people that don't really know the instrument. The harp is very much like a piano that you would put upside down. And so what happened is, like, instead of having hammer plug, touching the string, you have your hand or your fingers that are plucking the strings. However, if you put a piano upside down and you try to reach the bottom note and then the higher note of the keyboard, you're going to end up playing like this, which is completely not realistic. It's too much of a offside. So we had to invent a system to reduce the size and the number of strings. And so what happens, because we have more or less a similar range to a grand piano. It's a little smaller, but it's more or less the same. So what did we do to reduce this space? We only use 7 strings per octave. Basically, 1 string per note. You know that pianists, they have access to 12 half tones, 12 half steps, 12 semitones in an octave. They have like C, C sharp, D, D sharp, E, F, F sharp, G, G sharp, A sharp, B, and then it starts again. This is 12 tone. And for us, space needs, we have only 1 for 7 strings per octave, 7 notes per octave. So 1 for each note, basically C, D, E, F, G, A, B, Do, Re, Mi, Fa, Sol, La, Si, and then it starts again. So if you play a harp in a neutral position, so from the C that you can see here, it's the red strings. That's also why do we have colors, is to know where we're putting our fingers. So red is C, and then D, E, F is black, G, A, B, C, and then it starts again. So you're gonna tell me, but then how do you do your C sharp or your D flat or whatever? Well, then we are using our feet to do that, and this is all thanks to a genius inventor who allowed the pedal system to be as complete as possible. I'm going to elaborate on that, but basically we have 7 strings per octave, seven notes per octave, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si, and we have 7 pedals. One pedal, each of the 7 pedals are associated with a note. So we have a pedal that is associated with the si, the note do, for example. So here, when I move the pedal, I'm going to try to show you a little closer what's happening. You see, we have like a set of little pins. You're going to see they move. If you look at the red string, so I'm going to try to show you with my fingers. It's kind of hard to pinpoint. There you go. So you can see that there is movement there. And this is happening because I am actioning the pedal. And so what happens is like when I action the pedal and I put the pedal on the flat position, the C pedal, then all of the C's of the harp are becoming flat. And then I'm going to action the pedal to put it in the natural position. And then the little pin here is going to turn and change the length of every C strings on the harp. And every C's are going to be natural. All the C's. Then I can do it another time to go to sharp. It's not super in tune, I'm sorry. But there is a little joke about that actually. Like Toscanini said that the harpist, most of them were spending 90% of their life tuning to play the remaining 10% out of tune. So that's a big example. And so for some of you that have a little more education about the harp, is like, you're going to tell me, but a C sharp is the same thing as a D flat. And I'm going to tell you, yes, of course. And so if I use a C sharp and a D flat, and I play to you the 2 strings, the C sharp and the D flat, I have the same tone. The thing is like it's doubled. So then with this, you can do so many cool effects. So because you can double the note. So if you double a note in an octave, then you exclude another one. So then is born the glissando effect. The glissando, which was one of the more defining things in the orchestral writing for harp actually.
That's the sound we all have when we're remembering something from the past too.
Yeah.
That I have to be honest with you, I've sat in orchestras most of my professional life, and I thought that the pedal shifted every single string into a new key, not just specific ones. And the fact that you said there are 7 sort of characters. It's the same on a trumpet. We have really 7 combinations of tubing we can add, which changes the overall length of the instrument. We are, by the way, we are nerding out here. If you're still watching, good on you for sticking around for this technical stuff about acoustics. But this is how these composers came up with this stuff. I want to talk about this really quickly. The evolution of the harp. Talk about the chromaticism or the chromatic harp versus the pedal harp, and the fact that, and you can help me clarify the details here, but there was sort of a commercial war on this where 2 companies hired some very well-known composers to write showpieces and see who would win. I think this is amazing for so many reasons. Number one, that the technique was so interesting to people that that anybody cared, and that the greatest composers of the time, Debussy and Ravel, were actually hired to like promote this. How did that all end up? I guess we know the answer, considering you're sitting there with it.
No, but like kudos to you for naming this. It's actually one of the good sides of capitalism. Capitalism doesn't have a lot of good sides to it, but this is one of them. This is coming from a Frenchman to an American man. So the point is like the harp for a very long time, because the pedal system existed for a long time. Even already when Mozart composed his concerto, there was a pedal system. The thing is like it was not complete. It would allow only one change on every string. So you couldn't have flat, natural, and sharp on a string. It could only change once. So you had to pick your game. The thing is like it all changed completely in 1812 when a genius French engineer, Sébastien Erard, is also the guy who invented the how to double the note on the piano, or playing the same note very fast and repeating it. He's the inventor of that. He was just a genius. He invented the current pedal system that allows us to change twice per string. And so what happened is like it was created the instrument, the one that we use today, the classical harp, in 1812, which is fairly recent in the classical music world. That's why also Beethoven never wrote a harp part in his pieces, Brahms neither. All of these big composers, because at that time the harp was not able to modulate in every key and was very unreliable mechanically and very weak in sound. And so after 1812, there was a total change of approach, and thanks to big soloists like an English guy called Elias Paris-Alvars, the harp they started to tour Europe with their instrument and prove that it was worth it in a way. And so from there, people like Wagner or Berlioz started to get interested in the instrument. And so they started to add it in their music. Berlioz' Symphonie Fantastique is a little example. All of the Ring by Wagner uses 6 harps, these kind of things. And so then after that, the harp started growing. And when it grew and it attracted more attention, this new pedal system attracted more attention too. But there was a concurrent system called the chromatic harp system. It was, instead of having pedals, you had 12 strings per octave, like a piano. So it was so crowded, like already it's, for me, like my fingers are big and I cannot my finger in between 2 strings, it's already touching both of them. At the time, there was an extra string between every string, which was awful. And so to make the space, they would like intertwine them diagonally. So you had the middle that was the natural, and then all the alteration would come in between. And that was called the chromatic harp, and that was a nightmare to play because you multiply the number of strings, you also reduce the sound quality and the capacity of sound, the power of sound, because the soundboard has more holes in it, so you cannot produce as much power. But in any case, those two systems were competing at the end of the 19th century, and the two harp makers. So one of them was Erard, the one who invented. So the original inventor was dead, but the company still existed and bear his name. So the Erard factory in Paris, and the Lyon Pleyel. Pleyel is still building piano, was still building piano for a very long time, and was building the chromatic harp, the one without pedals. And so both of them, at the verge of the beginning of the 20th century, they wanted their instrument to win this war, or to be the one who remained. And so the first one to strike was Lyon Pleyel, who asked Claude Debussy to compose 2 dances, which is an amazing piece of music for harp and string orchestra. And so, and he wanted really it to kind of expose the harp as a chromatic instrument. So it used combination that would not normally have been possible on the pedal harp. However, and to fight against that, Erard, the harp maker, asked Maurice Ravel to compose Introduction and Allegro, which is like one of the most beautiful chamber music piece. It's a septet for flute, clarinet, string quartet, and harp. And you can play it with more strings if you want, so like small chamber orchestra and harp. And that would use all of the aspects of the pedal harp, which is mostly, it used a lot of glissandos. And this piece is really has a lot of like beautiful moments when you use this, and then, and it sounds like a chord, but it's really a special effect associated with pedal changes. And so both of these pieces were very successful, but very fast, because a French harpist decided to transcribe the Debussy dances on pedal harp. And actually Debussy, after listening to his piece composed for chromatic harp played on pedal harp, said that it sounded as well, if not better, on the pedal harp than it did on the chromatic one. And in the end, the chromatic harp survived, and the pedal harp survived, and the chromatic harp slowly lose momentum.
Talking about musicians, talking about composers or engineers, because clearly someone was an engineer who helped design this instrument. It reminds me of Jacob Collier going to MIT and talking to some electrical engineer to create an instrument that could split his voice into at least 16 different voices at the same time through what he was playing on his keyboard. So I think the innovation still happens today, but it's certainly not as central to our society as it probably was in the time of Debussy and Ravel.
Yeah, it's true. At the same time, we the scope of things we can search on now has gotten so big. And why would you try to produce a better instrument? You can change the world by creating AI.
That is true. That's another podcast. So, speaking of instrument makers, this is a good time to just take a quick pause and give some love to the sponsor of the Honesty Pill podcast, the Yamaha Corporation of America. You guys have heard me talk about Yamaha a lot. Emmanuel and I were just talking about his experiences in Colombia and teaching at Yola. And aside from the spectacular instruments that Yamaha creates and the way that they really support their artists, the real reason that I love them and was so proud to have them sponsor this podcast and me as an artist is their dedication to music education. And you can learn more about Yamaha by going to their website, yamaha.usa.com. And just they've been doing all they can to bring quality, professionally designed instruments, student instruments, in the hands of kids who don't have access for over 60 years. And that is something that I want to keep seeing happen more. So if you want to learn more about Yamaha, check out their website. But thank you so much to Yamaha for sponsoring this podcast and bringing this to you 100% free, other than you clicking like and subscribe on this video right now, which will help me continue bringing this stuff to you for zero cost. Okay, just with all the chromaticism and the pedals that you just demonstrated, it is a very maintenance-heavy instrument, isn't it?
Yes, it is, and it's also a very disappointing one, even for when you want to be a professional. I see you guys in the trumpet section constantly, thinking about intonation and like the magic also on the trumpet or any brass or a lot of the instruments that you can play with your mouth is like if you alter a tiny bit your mouth position, you can kind of play with intonation. I mean, there is a the thing is like for us, we tune the harp before starting to play it, and then the tuning is fixed, and we need to deal with what we have. We can do small adjustments very discreetly when we have the time to do them, and I try to do that as much as I can in situation when I'm playing an orchestra concert. Um, but for us, it's like once it is tuned, um, then we have to do with the tuning we have. The problem is like when you start a concert with an orchestra, any professional orchestra, they start at a certain pitch, and an hour later, if you would measure their pitch, it's not the same. It evolves. It's a living thing. It evolves for different reasons: fatigue, change of temperature in the room, excitement, and then because people are constantly adjusting in an orchestra, string people, like brass people, you always listen to the ensemble and you try to get with it. The thing with us is we cannot do that. So we have to tweak our tuning so that it's going to stay acceptable throughout the performance. So, for example, when an orchestra tunes at 440, I tune the harp at 441 because if I don't, at the end of the concert, I'm going to sound like I'm a quarter tone too low. I'm exaggerating, but it's a big problem, and you really need to be thinking about that. And also, there is another problem: is like we have the tendency to want to tune as fast as we can because we do it dozens of thousands of times during our lives, if not a million times maybe. And it's 47 strings to tune, and so you do that every day, several times a day. And so, of course, after a while, you want to be faster in the way of doing it. And the easygoing thing to be faster is to use an electronic tuner. And of course, it's practical, it's reliable in a way, but it's not perfect. It's physically perfect, but human ear has nothing of a machine. Is human ear is much more complex than this, and most of the human ears, when you get high up in the pitch, they need to hear it a little higher for to feel comfortable in tune. And if you go low in pitch, they want the human ear is going to feel comfortable if it's a little lower. And tuners, electronic tuners, don't are just like following an algorithm, an equation. They don't really take that into account. And so when I tune the harp before an orchestra concert, I use the machine for like the middle register, most of it. But then I fine tune by ear for the lower register and the higher register, and especially the higher one because it's the one that is the most used in the orchestral repertoire. Like people love to use like small chords in the top register. And if those are tuned with the machine, you can be sure you're going to sound too low, basically. And so you need to use your ears and you need to train them properly. And the problem is like there is not enough training done on that in school. Like a lot of teachers just said like use the machine to the top of the harp, just the machine, and you're fine. And you'd be surprised the number of professional harpists I have played with in my life that I would see play as loud as they can the higher register to have the mic of their tuner pick the note instead of just trying to play an octave and adjust it accordingly. Then comes the problem of the mechanical very quickly. The pedals, it's like a little fork turning and reducing the length of the string. This is, of course, there is an angle, but there is also a pressure. And the more you use your pedals, the more it's like a screw, it gets a little loose. And so it changes a little bit. So we need to have our harps regulated very often. And even though the regulation includes an intonation check, it's very often not done thoroughly enough. So we end up with instruments that can be in tune when they are in natural, but out of tune when they're in flat, or when you use the sharp pedal, then the sharp is going to be either too high, too low. And this is tweaked between, it is different between every instrument. And the thing is like you need to know your harp, because there is no way you are going to have it technically perfect. It's not going to happen. It's too much of a precise science. It's like you cannot ask if the technician needed to do that, he would need to spend 20 hours with a harp. And even though it would hold for 2 months, and then you would have to get him again. So it doesn't work like this. You need to know your instrument and adjust and fine tune yourself. But it's the biggest challenge for an orchestra harpist is to play in tune and to know how to do it properly.
The trumpet players always say, "Dress sharp, play sharp." That's our motto. But also, the biggest challenge for you is just carrying the thing, especially if you don't happen to have the Walt Disney Concert Hall crew to tote your harp around. So this actually leads to a question from the chat, which is, how do you physically and mentally prepare for auditions playing on an unfamiliar instrument? Because most people who are flying to Los Angeles or New York or Berlin or wherever, they're not bringing their harp with them. So how can you just sit down and know your instrument when it's not actually your instrument?
I have a very good story about that very briefly. I auditioned for so I got the Paris Opera job in 2006 when I was 21. And before that, I had lost like 5 or 6 other orchestra auditions in Paris. I went usually to the final rounds, but yeah, I wouldn't pass the final one. And then I remember so Paris Opera was my first professional orchestra, 2006. And then after 4 years, there was an opening at the Vienna Phil. Actually, so it was not, the Vienna Phil doesn't hold auditions, so the Vienna State Opera, to be precise. And when you join the Vienna State Opera, if you are lucky and good enough, sometimes you will get an invitation to perform in the Vienna Phil. But when I went to Vienna for the audition, I didn't know the instrument, and the instrument I was auditioning. And I had another harp to warm up on than the one I played in the audition. And God, we had to start the audition, the preliminary audition, with Harp Cadenza by Bedřich Smetana from Mavlast. And it's very powerful, forte chord, like strong chord, played with a lot of strength and energy. And I get behind the screen, I enter the audition space, and I put the harp on my shoulders and I play the first chord, and with all of my might, I would say, Mighty Ceysson plays the first chord, and I completely saturate the instrument, and so when you saturate the harp, it's pretty brutal. Like it can get really, really bad. It's something like first note of the audition. So obviously it was sufficient for not even maybe for the jury, it was sufficient to kick me out, but for myself, I kicked myself out, and I was not in the process in my head from this first note. I was out. I was like, oh my God, I made a shade of myself. I'm done. This is done. And of course, I didn't pass a preliminary audition. And actually, the harpist who won the audition had been smart enough to come to Vienna a few days before and try the audition harp and knew what she could do on it. The thing is, like, what I would say for what advice I would give to most of the harpists that don't have the chance to bring their instrument to an audition is to ask for a moment to try the harp before. If this is not possible, and usually most of the orchestra are organized enough to have different instruments, and you can come a day ahead and pick between different ones, and then they will try to their best to make you play on the instrument you picked. But so there are a couple of things depending on the parts you have to play that you need to know. So the strongest moment to know the limit of the instrument when you play strongly, or then also like every pedal system is going to be a little different. So when if you have a lot of pedal changes in one of the accepts, for example, practice that. But you need to prepare yourself in the process of preparing for the audition for that. You need to know if you have like 10 minutes to try on a harp, what you need to play, and not just go randomly with your concerto, for example. It's not going to work out this way.
Great answer. That presupposes that your confidence level is such that you would make the arrangements to get to the audition city a few days early and try the harp. Many people will self-sabotage at an audition by just, not spending that extra money on hotels and food and whatever.
The problem, Christopher, is like I think an audition is a lottery in many ways. Like, of course, you can prepare to the best of your abilities, but there is never an insured result out of it. It depends on so many parameters, and so the more parameters you can put on your side, and this is one of the big ones, trying the instrument before, you should, if you really want the job.
Yeah, that's great advice. Oh, here's another question from the chat. Have you ever dealt with performance anxiety, Emmanuel, and how did you work through it?
I would love to tell you, no, never.
I know. I don't know what they mean. What does this mean?
Anxiety, like, what
Getting,
does that mean? Well, if someone, like, when I was a young player in my early teenage years, I think I was fearless. I would go on stage and I was excited, not frightened. And I think I was lucky because a lot of people start to experience stress from an early age. But for me, when I grew up, I was excited to be on stage. It was nothing that I was not, I didn't want to hide. I was happy to be there. And I think when I grew up, the thing that made me more and more afraid had nothing to do with my playing. It had all to do with the way I would be perceived by people. And I think it's where fear and anxiety resides in many ways. It's like, if you want to come on stage to please people, then you're going to be afraid. If you come on stage with some kind of satisfaction of the work you have accomplished and being proud of your work, the feeling of anxiety is going to be really reduced. And it gets to another point when you go to an audition, because an audition is awful for anxiety. And why is it awful? It's because when you get there, you are starting to be in a state of comparison. You are comparing yourself constantly to people. It's awful. It's like you listen to someone behind the door and you think they play so much better than you do. And then when you prepare, you also try to put yourself, how should I play to satisfy the jury? And this is the first mistake you should not do. You should not play to satisfy the jury. You should play the way you are. If it pleases the jury and they want to advance you, great. If it doesn't please the jury, maybe it was not your audition to take. You know what I mean? I always think that you need to be true to yourself, and it's the way to avoid a maximum of anxiety. Of course, it gets more complicated because there are a certain set of things you need to follow when you pass an audition. But still, I think if you try to apply for an orchestra that the sound aesthetic is so far from you, and sometimes you can make parallel between US, for example, and European orchestras, then you are setting up yourself for failure.
That was actually another question about the difference between U.S. and European. Here's one more question for you, and then we'll wrap up here, which is, how would you characterize the difference between symphonic and opera orchestra repertoire in terms of your instrument or your preparation for auditions?
Opera is the best.
Yep.
Let me explain. It's like, I think it was when I learned the most about music in my life, from my first years playing in an opera orchestra, for different reasons. The first one is being the conductor in an opera orchestra has to deal with singers much more than he has to deal with you. So it leaves you a margin of of musicality, of like self-expression bigger than in a symphony, when sometimes you have a control freak beating you the pattern and not leaving you any space. So I love conductors, but this was for me the best school. Is like, when you play in an opera, you are part of something much bigger than you. You are part of a dramatic plot, and you play with the most unstable artists you can find on the planet, who are singers. And when I say unstable, it's because they don't really have, they know how to sing, but they don't. What does it mean knowing how to sing? It's like, it's to control an operatic voice is one of the hardest thing, because it's inside of you. You cannot really have external parameter to explain what's happening. You need to use a lot of resonating parts of your body, etc., etc. And so a singer is the most complicated musician in many ways. And so when you play in an opera orchestra, you need to adapt to them. You need to be constantly monitoring what they are doing, especially when you play the harp, which is usually a big solo under them. Usually when you have a harp opera, it's like accompanying the soprano or the main male role. And so you need to have your ears open and adapt to that. And it's demanding a lot. So for me, I think opera was also what taught me to be a better musician, a broader musician, to develop more things in terms of sound. Symphonic is a very different approach. Of course, you are saving the music also, but I would say you are trying to integrate it. So it's more, it gonna be closer to chamber music to me in a way. You need to think of how your sound is going to define the whole mass of the orchestra, and what you need to do to bring something without being a disturbance to the music discourse in a way.
That's it's a great answer, because I actually think of orchestral music as chamber music as well. Funny coming from a trumpet player, since our job is to, play loud in the White
Yes.
Knight on the horse, but we are all chamber musicians. The best orchestras I've ever played with are the ones that listen to each other and on top of the conductor's instructions. So that's a great way to put it. Two last questions. The red harp. When people walk into Walt Disney Concert Hall, before any of us are even on stage, the first thing they see is your Lion and Healy, beautiful red, unusual looking instrument. Can you just talk really quickly about why did you have that instrument commissioned or built this color? Is it part of your brand? Is it part of your musical statement? What does that mean? And is it an intentional thing?
It is an intentional thing. However, it was not my choice originally. What happened is that, so you have a few big harp makers in the world, and the biggest of them all is Lion and Healy. They are based in Chicago. They have been building harps for more than 150 years. And so for their 150 years anniversary, they decided to produce a red harp of the Salcedo design. Salcedo was a French harpist who moved to the United States and became some kind of a harp guru here. He founded a school of technique that is still being taught today. And he also designed, with the help of a designer from New York, a model that bears his name, the Salcedo model. It's very different from what most of the harp you're going to see. It's not golden, and it's not heavily decorated. It's very geometrical. It's an Art Deco design from 1927. And so for their 150th anniversary, the company that was Lion Healy, that is building harps, decided to produce a model in red in this finish. And so why red is because red was a color that this harpist, Carlos Salcedo, he loved very much, and he had a particular kind of red he would get from a special shop in New York to correct the scores of his students. And so what they did is they collected scores from Salcedo students, and they got the exact same nuance of red, and they produced the Salcedo harp in color. And as I was a regular player of the instruments, they invited me to play at these celebrations, and I was the first one to play this red Salcedo, and I realized how much of an impact it had visually on stage. So, and then I decided to acquire the instrument, and after that, the rest is history, because I basically only played red harps after that. I got red harps at the Met, and we have now 2 red harps at the Venetia, things like this.
I think it's brilliant, and I think there's definitely a visual element that's lacking from the symphonic experience that you do get in the Met or Paris Opera, where there's so much to look at. And I think that the red harp is just a start. I think we need to get a little bit more rock and roll in our
Yes.
orchestra concerts and make them more engaging and more interesting.
Yeah, true.
I'll play a red trumpet. I think they make
Do
them. I'll
that.
have to order
Yeah,
them.
yeah, and like we should, have
Yeah,
some color details on
absolutely.
ourselves too.
Here's the last question that I always ask everyone, which is, so Honesty Pill is sort of like the moment for me was deciding, am I going to keep working at a running store selling shoes, or am I going to figure out what I need to do with my instrument to start winning auditions? Is there a moment where you faced a major challenge or a moment where you had to get really honest with yourself that made you rethink your path or approach that ended up with you winning these incredibly huge jobs on the harp?
Yes, yes. So as I said, I didn't, start winning from the start. I mean, I don't think it happens to anyone. The first rule is to get yourself out there as much as you can. I know it's expensive to pay for a plane ticket and a hotel to go to an audition, but you are not going to win an audition. You are not going to win the first audition you take in your life. It happens to less than 1% of the people that do it, in my opinion. I don't have the statistics, but it's very unlikely. So what happened to me is that fresh out of the Paris Conservatoire, I started actually taking auditions when I was there, and I would always pass the first stages. And I realized after a couple of auditions that it was because I was great at playing the solo rep, like the concerto or the things like this. And because I was trained as a soloist at the Paris Conservatoire, trained to be a soloist, trained to approach everything, even the orchestral repertoire, like the orchestral excerpts, as solo pieces. And I think that's where my first mistake was, in a way. So what happened is, like, after failing at 4 or 5 times, um, I started to completely change the approach of preparing, especially for orchestral excerpts. So what I did is that I tried to think, okay, in the panel in front of you, those are not harpists. Those are not your peers judging you. Those are sensitive musicians that don't know anything technically about your instrument. They don't know anything about how to produce a sound. They don't know anything about the pedals. They don't know anything about the dynamics, etc. What they know about the harp is what they hear in the orchestra by their orchestral harpist, the one person you are trying to replace. And so it gave me it was like a night and day after that. I started to really prepare the orchestral repertoire very very in a much more sensible way. I was thinking of what is it that a musician that has no idea about the harp is what that they're going to hear. And I started to play for friends of mine that were flutists, trumpet players, pianists, violin players, and asking them, okay, let me play you this excerpt. And then they would come back with questions like, what was this noise there? But your phrase was not well done, or these kind of things. And then I really completely changed the paradigm, in a way. I changed the approach completely and tried to work as a sensitive musician also in the orchestral repertoire. Don't I in my first advice I give to any students I teach orchestral repertoire is like, don't try to think that it's only about playing the notes in rhythm, in place, and perfectly without any mistakes. This is like 0.1% of the way.
It's great advice. And I think the greatest advice I give people for auditions is play for people who don't play your instruments, because they don't care that your reed wasn't good, or that that's a big stretch, or that that note isn't good. They just hear that didn't sound good. When I play for my wife, the clarinetist, she definitely holds back nothing in terms of
Yeah.
her awareness. So that's a great piece of advice.
Well, my pleasure.
Thank you so much for sharing some time with us. And I hope I've made it clear you're just a pleasure to work with on stage. And I'm looking forward to trading some beer for some of those baked goods.
Of course, let's do that. I will see you next week, actually, and maybe tomorrow morning. Are you doing the kids program?
I am. Yes, I am. I'll see you there in the morning. I'll bring coffee.
Thank you for having me, man. It was a pleasure.
Hang on for 1 second. I'm just going to say goodbye to everybody watching. All right, everybody, go check out Emmanuel's website at Emmanuel Ceysson, CEYSSON.com, and go download one of his many, many, many commercial recordings available through his website at bandcamp.com. That is bandcamp.com. I'll put all that in the show notes, of course. And thank you for listening. It really does mean a lot to me that you show up and listen to what we talk about here. And thank you for supporting the channel. All right, everybody, that's it for me. I'm out of here. Happy practicing. And until then, go bake something or brew a beer, and happy practicing.